So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers. I'm really quite shocked and excited to be invited here as a sort of classicist with feet of clay. I want to talk about the people. I'm working in well-trodden territory. There's lots of productive, radical ways to reconstitute and re-understand the we that Mark pointed out that we're allergic to the we. But people are working on how to do this. Ways that can work for justice or liberation. All I'm trying to do is to excavate one of the sedimented pasts in our concepts of the people, to think about how we can interrogate and maybe loosen some of the ways that that concept is crowded around with the who, the relationship to the individual. So in this, it's going to be rather different from what you just said. This question of who's in and who's out, which then brings up questions of citizenship and immigration and whiteness and gender and all sorts of other things. Rome, I'm trying to propose, offers a way to think about a corporate rather than a collective we. So the not-so-democratic Roman Republic, which is the explicit model for the not-so-democratic American Republic, fundamentally rested on a claim that we recognize today, but that has historically been somewhat rare, which is we the people. We the people, the subject of this sentence, well, you the people, I'm not actually one of these people, I'm the enemy. But, in many ways, this document and others like it, and writing about the people, they constitute the people as object. The people is the subject of this sentence, but the document is actually about how can they be constituted, how can they be represented. But the claim is that we share with Rome is that the people are the beginning and the end of democracy. Both in Rome and today, despite the various ways in which neither republic is a full-throated democracy, the people are the end. They're the place where the buck stops, and thus the beginning. They're the sole source of legitimacy. The people are the end in the sense that all of this is for the people in some way. The people are the intended beneficiaries of democracy. The people are the end because the people and the people alone have the power to democratically decree democracy out of existence, to dissolve their own democratic institutions, which is one test of sovereignty, and which is something which in Rome they did. So that brings us to another end, because rhetorics about the people, and especially populism, are often cited as democracy's downfall, with Rome being a prime example. Looking to Rome has power precisely because how often we in the 21st century USA see the implicit or explicit claim that Romans were just like us, that we are the heirs of Rome for some value of we, right? As a historian of Rome, I see one of my tasks as interrogating how people today use Rome as an origin myth in order to justify things like white supremacy, all these elements of contemporary culture and society in which memories of Rome have been turned to violent and oppressive ends. But I think it's really important to also point out that historical reality was very violent and oppressive, right? I'm not trying to rescue the Romans. We're talking about a slave state, a conquest state. It had an empire well before it was an empire. These people weren't nice. Let's just be clear about that. But even though these people weren't nice, many of the features of the Roman political system cited by the people making these claims, and indeed these claims, are pure mirage, right? They bear very little resemblance to how today's historians of Republican Rome think politics was actually practiced in the 1st century BCE. But there's a limit to the amount of benefit that comes from a historian like me popping up and saying, well, actually the Roman Republic didn't crumble because of unrestrained immigration or something like that. Because in the end, it's what's happening now that's important, and if people don't use Rome to justify it, they'll just find a different justification. So I'm not trying to build a negative argument about Roman concepts of the people to say, oh, you're misunderstanding the populace, so if we understand it rightly, then we'll all be happier. No, that's not going to work. I do want to try to build a positive argument, a way in which the Roman populace, the concept that lies behind many contemporary Western understandings of the people, was in fact radically different from our current understanding. It can help us draw out some oddities in the way that concepts of the people get used now. And that gap can, I hope, be some sort of inspiration, provide an alternative route to some expressions of the people that don't look like the ones produced by standard citations of Rome and Roman law. So, what is the people? It's a concept that is ill-defined and manipulable, that is exclusionary, as well as sometimes inclusive. It's occupied political thinkers from Cicero to Rousseau to now. And the basic problem is that people, like you and me, are concrete and palpable. The people is abstract and nebulous. So, this is just Rousseau. The volonté générale is a different thing from the volonté de tous, right? It's not an aggregate of everyone. It's something else. A lot of us take that as read. So how did Romans deal with the difference between people and the people, which in Latin is populus? Well, they didn't. To them, there was nothing surprising in the fact that the population was a different thing from the populus. And one point, sort of cheap point to make, is that one reason they didn't have to struggle with that is because we are hampered by English, in which people is the plural of person, right? That's not true in most other languages, and it's not true in Latin. Right? There's no assumption that the people should be some kind of additive collective of all the people. So, this term, this idea of this kind of collective of all the people, any idea of everyone is remarkably absent in the Roman Republican political thought, which, it's not difficult to make a case that that's a very, very bad thing, but I think it can also be productive in some ways. So, political historians of the Roman Republic enjoy arguing about how much power the people had in the Roman system. From one perspective, however, the answer is zero. If by the people, you're thinking about individuals, about ordinary people. It's true that both in law and in everyday political discourse, the people were positioned as sovereign. So this famous bit of Livy summarizes a law from the 12 Tables, saying that the people make law. And one of the best demonstrations of this is the end of the Roman Republic, that the later power of the emperor is described in terms of the power that the people have given to them, that they used to have, that they've signed over. But these texts don't refer, like I was just saying, to a group of individuals or even to a class. They refer to the singular abstract populus, which is something else. The people are not sovereign. The populus is sovereign. So zooming forward, we can see how this doctrine has confused some modern attempts to understand the people. So this is Friedrich Karl von Savigny, born in 1779. He's the author of the fearsome multi-volume System des heutigen römischen Rechts, and he's an important player in the legal underpinnings of the modern nation state. So he identifies three ways of defining das Volk, the people. The first is the abstract totality that is equivalent to the state. It's everything. It's a totality. It probably includes sheep and mountains and things. It's very abstracted from individual people. It is the entity that he thinks ought to bear sovereignty, but it's a problem for him because it cannot bear a will. The second is the population, the totality of all the individual people. They have a will, but you can't really figure out what it is. Maybe they have a will. In any case, you can't figure out what it is. And the third, then, is the people institutionalized as a political assembly, a participatory institution of some kind that has procedures that lead to democratic decisions. So for Savigny, these three things are fundamentally different from one another. Recht, which I'm glossing as something like natural sovereignty, seems to belong to number one, but Macht, the ability to actually wield it, can only belong to number three. The line of thought he begins with goes like this, that 2 is in some way equivalent to 1, and 3 is an approximation of 2. The population is in some way the abstract totality. The problem is then merely practical, that we can't gather them all in one place at one time to take political action, so we approximate it with an assembly. But he's only putting forward this equation in order to challenge it. Savigny points out that there are a lot of people who don't get invited to the assembly. In his time and his place, his own example was women. It's obviously tempting to suggest that this was a very fixable issue, but I don't think I need to work through all the steps here to prove that the assembly is never going to be fully inclusive, right? So that means that the assembly is fundamentally, qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the thing that this line of thought thinks of it as representing. 2 no longer equals 3 in any sense. And yet Savigny certainly thinks that assemblies are probably the best solution, the best practical proxy for 1, even though his thought shows that they are essentially arbitrary. His conclusion is that if 3 is the best proxy for 1, but 2 is not equivalent to 3, then 1 cannot be equivalent to 2, right? Das Volk, the totality, is fundamentally different from the population. The people is not the sum or average of everyone's individual wills. It's its own thing, an abstraction, a legal fiction. So yes, this is just Rousseau, but seeing the steps, I think, helps us to understand how and why it brings in all kinds of problems of representation, of constituent power, and so on. Because there's always this underlying question of membership, even though he excludes it in the end from his calculation. That's what brings in the problems for him. And I've paused on Savigny because his immersion specifically in Roman law helps us see where some of his assumptions come from. He takes it as automatic, as axiomatic, that number 1 ought to be sovereign. That's a Roman assumption and not one that was necessarily shared in his own more recent history. And he also takes it as axiomatic that the only legitimate way to represent that will is via number 3. Again, a Roman take on things, that we determine the will of the people by assembling some group of them. But what he doesn't see is that for the Romans, there's no contradiction, right? The populace and not the people is sovereign. The population element in Savigny's thought confuses the issue. He ends up removing it. But for Romans, it was never there in the first place. It's a product of Savigny's moment, the development of the modern European nation state based on a territory that has a population, just some people who are sort of there in a remarkably kind of passive sort of way. And that kind of thinking was not known to the Romans. For Roman political thought, the populace was not a new legal fiction or a philosophical proposition that had to be invented. It was already institutionalized in vernacular political speech as well as political theory as an entity understood as fundamentally different from the population. It's a singular noun, it's an abstraction, though I'm going to explore some ways in which it was a remarkably concrete one. We can see this understanding played out daily in Roman political life. One of the central truths of Roman politics is that the group here present is exactly equivalent to the populace. It doesn't matter whether it's 10 people or 10,000. It doesn't matter whether it's diverse or homogeneous. Some of the time you need to do some kind of religious action to constitute it as the populace, only some of the time. Some of the time violence vitiates that act, only some of the time. Merely preventing anyone you don't agree with from entering the forum is not enough to vitiate the fact that this group here is the populus Romanus. There's no attempt to make sure that it's representative, that it in some ways represents the aggregate will or the average will of the population. Whatever group you have, political actors are going to address it as the populace, they're going to take its cheers or boos as a sign of the sovereign will of the populace, and they're going to accept that what it ordered was law. So I'd like you to remember that, and to a certain extent I'm asking you to trust me, because what I'm going to do now is go through a bunch of exceptions, because those are the interesting cases, right? Places where people are testing the boundaries of acceptable political discourse and meaning. But just to recap, without fully grasping the historical particularities of the Roman concept of populace, Savigny derives a remarkably similar set of ideas, and that's because he's working from an understanding based on one important thing in Roman law that sounds right to a modern mind, which is that the assembly has to wield Macht. And he misses the bit that sounds completely odd in a contemporary context, which is that the Romans have no concept about the population and its relationship to the assembly. All that matters is the abstract populace, and the assembly is defined as exactly equal to the populace. So, how can this abstraction, utterly divorced from any ordinary people, be useful for the ends of democracy? So, the populace is unitary, it's monolithic, it cannot be divided. I demonstrate this by contradiction. So the idea that there can be two populaces or a divided populace is monstrous. It's a portent on the scale of seeing two suns in the sky. It portends the end of the Republic. When it does happen, it's because there's a civil war happening, right? It's anathema. The Roman populace is not constituted by constructed by counting people, by adding them together. That might seem paradoxical because in practice there is a counting element. When you're having a vote, you have to count. But there's a very Roman twist. Once a majority is reached, the counting stops. We don't see people thinking about how large the majority was or how large the minority was. They're definitely agonistic, if not antagonistic Democrats, but once the decision is made, it is made. It becomes the one single unitary answer of the singular monolithic populus Romanus. Now, in the contemporary moment, the idea that the people are an ineffable abstraction with a single unitary will sounds pretty disturbing. Contemporary nationalistic populisms are characterized by claiming to speak for the people, which can be expressed as a pars pro toto argument, a claim that support coming from some people translates to a universal mandate. This claim that I and only I represent the true people definitely constructs an abstract notion of the people that's fundamentally different from any actual people out there. And it makes it very easy to see that what we're thinking about is not any people. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's an abstraction, it's very arbitrary. It's not real Americans, it's real America, right? There's plenty one could say about how populist rhetoric uses the idea of the people, but the point I want to emphasize is that it's not only populists who appeal to this abstract, idealized, transcendental people. The distinction between the abstract and the concrete is in fact an illusion. The folk, the volonté générale, they're by definition idealized and transcendent. The people, though it might be mobilized rhetorically in ways that claim a relationship with the concrete population, is in fact always abstract. So, I mean, if we acknowledge that, it's really easy to see how populist rhetoric responds to the broken promises of reality, right? We've got a vernacular political theory which is claiming that we're part of a group that holds sovereignty, and yet we don't get what we want. I mean, because sovereignty can only really belong to an abstraction, and the choice is an arbitrary one made by some distant actor, of which abstraction we're going to acknowledge right now. So what I'm saying we're dealing with is a different kind of abstraction, that this abstract and concrete dichotomy has to be complicated. So I'm going to skip quite quickly past this, but I've been quite inspired by Alan Fumarescu, who's written about the people's two bodies. He thinks about different forms of abstraction, the difference between a sort of additive, collective abstraction and a corporate abstraction. This is not the exact difference that I'm seeing in Rome, but it's really helped me think about how we can try to describe different modes of abstraction. So here is Cicero claiming that the abstract populus ought to be a politician's concern and not the tangible crowd. The true populace, the real Americans, or rather the real America, the transcendent abstraction whose well-being the elite can consider, rather than actually consulting anyone's actual opinion. So this is doing what I say Romans don't do, right? And when he has to justify that position, he can't justify that position by saying that the assembly is unrepresentative, right? That is absolutely taboo. You're not allowed to say that. It doesn't make sense. So what he has to say is that the expressions of the assembly that he doesn't like are not the will of the populace, because this is no true populace. It is corrupt, it is vitiated, it is entirely composed of hirelings. It's not that it's a bad populace, it's that the populace is not there, something else has been put in its place. So nowhere, I think, does Cicero challenge the underlying axiom that the assembly is the populace. He's saying that there's been some kind of error or fault. And so the opposing claim is not that the votes of my assembly should be your concern rather than the transcendent populace. The opposing claim is relying on the equation between all assemblies, including this one, and the transcendent populace. This is not a distinction between the abstract people contrasted with the tangible reality of these people right here. Cicero's opponents are also appealing to a singular abstract populace. But there's still obviously a difference between a populace physically present in the forum and the populace that Cicero idealizes. And the distinction that I'm looking at is treated by some German legal scholars, more recently than Savigny, as a distinction between the Populus als Staat versus the Populus als Volksversammlung. Cicero is a big fan of the Populus als Staat, the distant abstraction analogous to the Volonté Générale. I think the unspoken element here is that, of course, he wants to assign sovereignty to that abstract totality populace, because then in practice he can make his own decisions without having to deal with the messy, unpredictable assemblies. But the other pole of the equation is not a concrete group of people. The assembly populace is firmly abstract in that it is not contingent. This assembly today is the same populace as that assembly tomorrow. It's also not arbitrary, right? You can have it anytime, any place. I mean, it's not arbitrary in that it's super arbitrary. Any group of people is the populace. So it's not the concrete contrasted with the abstract, nor is it the plural people as individuals contrasted with the singular people. And yet it is still different from the distant abstraction that Cicero prefers, in that the assembly people, the Populus als Volksversammlung, is an embodied experience that an individual Roman can have. So in that sense, it does have a relationship between the individual. And I think that that experience must be at the core of vernacular political theory, how ordinary Romans understood their own relationship to the populace. Cicero, especially in his theoretical works, is, I think, making a very new move in attempting to detach the assembly from the state. It's a partisan and innovative political move, very influenced by Greek political theory, which is not really at play when he's talking directly to the people. And his opponents are saying, no, the assembly absolutely is the populace. So I think the element of the populace in Rome, which goes some way towards explaining how these two things can be identical, is that the populace can never just be a passive ideal. It can never just be an abstraction in whose name a politician acts, like the appeal to real America. Because just as the Populus als Volksversammlung, I'm claiming, rests on embodied experience and action, the Populus als Staat is extraordinarily active. The Populus Romanus, in legal and cultural terms, is a protagonist. It's the protagonist of politics. It's the one that issues the decrees, the orders, jussa, right? They're not statements of opinion. They're speech acts that become fact. It's the protagonist of external relations. It's the Populus Romanus that's off conquering new provinces. It's the Populus Romanus, and not individual commanders, who contract relationships of friendship with foreign kings, right? The Populus Romanus holds the same role as the foreign king. The Populus Romanus is the protagonist of Roman history. It's the owner of the land that Rome has conquered. It's the owner of all the gold in the treasury. It's, in the end, the owner of the res publica itself, which is a remarkably empty term. It's the publicus in res publica, which is related directly to populus, that has force. So in Cicero's famous quotation, the res publica, it's not just the public thing, it's the populus's thing. This is an ownership relation. Now, a slightly more radical approach to this, which I do see in the ancient sources, and I think drawing very much on usages like this, but I see it also at play in political speech, is that the populace is not just every political assembly. The populace is every instance of collective action. For all these things, we would probably say America did something, Germany did something, or Rome did something. Athenians said the Athenians did something, right? They use a plural noun. But Romans say the Populus Romanus did something. So Populus als Staat, I think, captures one element of this discourse very well. The populace is the state. And the people is not a given. It's not an object. It's not the population of a certain territory. It is whoever is doing the doing. It votes. It cheers. Most fundamentally, it witnesses, which is a whole other talk. It's this sense of the populace as the protagonist of politics, as the nearest equivalent that Rome has to a state, I think, that makes it so hard for anyone, for Cicero, to dismiss the embodied experience of voting in the assembly in favor of a hazily remembered ideal. It's also very difficult for anyone to claim a monopoly on the popular mandate, on the mandate of the populace, because a potential problem with this whole arrangement, that the unified, monolithic, sovereign, utterly legitimated populace in the form of this assembly over here today can decree that we're going to war, or that you are the general, or that the tax rate is 5%. And then tomorrow, this unified, monolithic populace over here can declare that we're going to have peace, and you're now the general, and the tax rate is 25%. Romans knew this. It wasn't a problem for them. It happened all the time. It especially happened because, if you recall, packing the assembly with only your supporters was fine, was something they did. If you don't like the answer that the populace gives, you can always just ask again. The answer is the answer, but only until the next answer. The legitimacy is absolute, but until it's entirely effaced. So this is where I think it's really quite anarchic. So how did the Romans deal with that? Well, they just accepted it. Remember this principle: whatever the populace last ordered is law, right? That's there for a reason. The assumption is that there's going to be toing and froing. They just made it work. So I have been accused of saying, isn't this just anarchy? I say, yeah, fine. So I have 2 points that I want to make with this data. One is that committing to the idea that the people is always an abstraction can seem scary and exclusionary, too close to a real American narrative. But in fact, the abstraction can, I think, be made to offer forms of inclusion, because the people is not a group of people defined by membership, but it does have to be embodied in some kind of collective action. So it's possible to be okay with the fact that the membership of the assembly can be different at different times for different reasons, and still be a valid expression of the will of the transcendent people. Incidentally, I'm definitely not saying that this was what happened in Rome, although I do say, when they say the populace is whoever's in front of me, that includes women and enslaved people and dogs, They get to shout and throw things. It's not inclusive, but it offers a different set of solutions to the problems of representation and constituent power. Because it's an abstraction, we can call on its power of legitimation in many different ways and on different scales. The result might be a lot of different decisions, contradictions, back and forths. I'm not qualified to say how it would work in practice if we tried anything based on it today, but in theory it does seem to be one way of underpinning the legitimacy of the type of open democracy called for by Helen Landemore, including large numbers of what she calls micro-publics making devolved local decisions. Again, I'm not saying that this is my way forward. It's a space of imagination. But in ways that Romans could never have envisaged, it would be possible to constitute these groups by choice, by interest, by doing, by action, by showing up, rather than legal membership of some electorate. The monolithic singularity of a Roman-style corporate, never collective populace actually allows a huge amount of variety. How much time have I got? Maybe a minute. Okay. There's a whole bit about constituent power here. Carl Schmitt's people are not in the end active. Constitution is something that is done to them. Aoife Donoghue and Ruth Houghton have some great stuff on feminist theories of constituent power, which is about a series of active claims to be a voice setting the terms of inclusion, which I really love and I recommend to you. But the thing I want to take from it is that every collective act can be a moment of constitution. So the goal of an open democracy, decisions being made by a very large number of small publics, for Landemore, the goal is not just curing democracy with more democracy, it's not just localism, it's getting more people involved in politics, getting more action. So that's the second and final thing I want to emphasize, which is that the lesson that I take from the Roman case is that we can build an understanding in which the active experience of politics is key. Saying that the people can be whoever's doing the doing, and not just in the sense that we form movements through collective actions, but that the group has a claim to the legitimacy of the totality. So not just a legitimacy built on the legitimacy of each individual. So that can be dangerous, this idea that any group can be legitimate. It could remind us of rhetorics that allocate full citizenship to, people who do the right thing, to soldiers or mothers, But that's not what I mean. I mean that doing is trying to live in community. Being is doing. That kind of action is key. Key to creating a people who are not just the end of democracy, not just the thing served, but who embody democracy. Thank you.